Okay, so picture this. You're sitting at a diner somewhere, there's a burger in front of you, maybe some fries, and without even thinking about it, you grab that bottle or that packet and you squeeze ketchup all over your food. It's automatic. It's the most American thing you could possibly do. But here's the thing, the actual history of ketchup, and I mean the real, documented, historical origin of ketchup, has almost nothing to do with tomatoes, has almost nothing to do with America. And at one point in history, it was literally sold to people as a medicine that was supposed to cure their diarrhea. I'm not joking. So today, we're covering the entire history of ketchup, from a fermented fish sauce in ancient China, all the way to the moment a guy convinced the American public to swallow tomato pills as medical treatment. And trust me, by the end of this, you're gonna look at that bottle in your fridge completely differently. Let's go all the way back, because the word ketchup itself is not English. It's not even close to English originally. Most food historians trace the word back to a Chinese term, something like ke-tsiap or ke-tsiap, depending on the dialect and the region. And this sauce, this original ke-tsiap, was made from fermented fish, and I mean fully fermented, salted, aged fish guts and brine, similar to what you'd find in modern fish sauce today, the kind you'd use in Thai or Vietnamese cooking. The fermentation process alone could take months, sometimes close to a year, with fish packed in salt inside clay jars, slowly breaking down until you were left with this incredibly potent, salty, umami-rich liquid. It had this deep, savory flavor, and it was used across parts of Southeast Asia and southern China as a flavor enhancer, kind of the way we use soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce today. There were no tomatoes involved. There wasn't even the concept of a tomato involved. Because remember, tomatoes are native to the Americas. And at this point, we're talking about a sauce that existed in Asia centuries before Europeans had ever set foot in the New World. So how does a fermented fish sauce from China end up becoming the tomato condiment sitting in your fridge right now? Well, this is where British sailors and traders come into the picture, because in the late 1600s and early 1700s, British ships were sailing all over Southeast Asia as part of the East India Company's trading routes, and sailors kept encountering this ke-tsiap sauce in ports across places like modern-day Malaysia, Indonesia, and parts of coastal China. They loved it. It kept well on long sea voyages without refrigeration, which was a massive deal at the time. It added flavor to otherwise bland shipboard food, and so British sailors started bringing it back home to England, trying to recreate it themselves. But here's the problem. They didn't actually have access to the same ingredients. They didn't have the specific fermented fish, they didn't have the same regional spices, so English cooks started experimenting, trying to recreate this exotic Asian flavor using whatever ingredients they had available in Britain. And this is where things get genuinely strange, because British ketchup, and I'm using air quotes here, went through decades of wildly different versions that had absolutely nothing to do with tomatoes. There was mushroom ketchup, which was incredibly popular in England throughout the 1700s and even into the 1800s, made by salting mushrooms until they released their liquid, then boiling that liquid down with spices into a dark, savory sauce that honestly looked more like soy sauce than anything we'd recognize today. There was walnut ketchup, made from pickled green walnuts, harvested before they even fully developed their hard shell, crushed down into this dark, tangy, almost vinegary paste. There was oyster ketchup, made from boiled down oyster liquor mixed with spices and vinegar. There was even a version made from anchovies that was much closer to the original Asian fish sauce concept. And some old British cookbooks from that era even included recipes for lemon ketchup and celery ketchup, which sounds absolutely bizarre by today's standards. Basically, in British English at the time,
ketchup didn't refer to one specific sauce, it referred to an entire category of thick, dark, savory, fermented, or pickled sauces used to flavor meat and fish dishes. Kind of the same way we might say salsa today and mean dozens of completely different recipes. Tomatoes weren't even part of the conversation yet, and honestly wouldn't be for a really long time, and this whole category of ketchup got carried over into colonial America along with British settlers who brought their cookbooks, their recipes, and their entire understanding of what ketchup was supposed to mean.
So when does the tomato actually show up in this story? Well, tomatoes had already made their way to Europe from the Americas by the 1500s, brought back by Spanish explorers. But here's something people don't realize. For a really long time, a lot of Europeans thought tomatoes were poisonous. Tomatoes are part of the nightshade family, and some related nightshade plants genuinely are toxic. So there was widespread suspicion around eating them for literally centuries. There's actually a popular legend, probably exaggerated, but still telling of the general fear at the time about wealthy Europeans getting sick and sometimes dying after eating tomatoes off pewter plates, which historians now believe had more to do with lead leaching out of the pewter from the tomato's acidity than the tomato itself. But at the time, obviously nobody understood that, so tomatoes just got blamed entirely. It wasn't until the late 1700s and early 1800s that tomatoes started becoming more widely accepted as a food in both Europe and colonial America. And once that suspicion started fading, some clever cooks in America started experimenting with adding tomatoes into that existing ketchup category of thick, dark, savory sauces that the British had already established. The first known published recipe specifically for tomato-based ketchup showed up in America in the early 1800s, credited to a scientist and horticulturist named James Meese, sometimes called the father of tomato ketchup, who published his tomato ketchup recipe around 1812. But get this, his original recipe didn't even include sugar. It was closer to a spiced tomato pulp, way more savory and tangy than what we recognize as ketchup today. And it definitely wasn't the smooth, sweet, bright red sauce we're used to. It was chunkier, more like a rustic tomato relish than a smooth condiment. Homemade tomato ketchup recipes started spreading throughout American households over the following decades, passed down through family recipe books. But here's where the story takes an absolutely wild turn, because in the 1830s, a physician named Dr. John Cook Bennett became convinced that tomatoes had incredible medicinal properties. And I mean, he really believed this. Bennett published claims arguing that tomatoes could cure a whole list of ailments, including diarrhea, indigestion, jaundice, and even a condition he described that we now recognize as a form of cholera. And he wasn't shy about publishing these claims widely in newspapers and medical journals of the time. His claims spread fast, partly because Americans at the time were desperate for any kind of miracle cure, given how limited actual medicine was in that era. This was still decades before germ theory was widely accepted, and doctors genuinely had very few reliable treatments to offer patients. And this is where things get genuinely bizarre, because a businessman named Archibald Miles saw an opportunity in Bennett's claims and started manufacturing something called Dr. Miles Compound Extract of Tomato, which was sold in pill form as an actual medicine, marketed directly to the American public as a cure for a wide range of digestive issues. These tomato pills became genuinely popular for a period of time in the 1830s, and multiple competing brands popped up trying to cash in on the tomato medicine craze, some even bigger and more aggressively marketed than the original, with names like Dr. Phelps' Compound Tomato Pills, flooding pharmacy shelves and newspaper advertisements across the country. But here's the problem. A lot of these tomato pill products weren't actually made with much real tomato at all. Some manufacturers cut corners hard, using dangerous fillers and ingredients to bulk up their product cheaply, including, in some documented cases, mercury-based compounds that were common in questionable medicine at the time. And there were documented cases of people getting sick, and in some situations dangerously so, from consuming these so-called tomato medicine pills. Eventually, actual doctors and medical critics of the time started publicly exposing the tomato pill craze as largely fraudulent, pointing out there was no real scientific backing behind most of these medicinal claims, and the whole tomato pill industry collapsed by the early 1840s, becoming one of the earlier documented examples of what we'd now call a health scam or snake oil marketing scheme in American history. But here's the interesting side effect of this entire strange chapter. The tomato pill craze, fraudulent as it was, had done something incredibly valuable completely by accident. It had gotten millions of Americans used to the idea that tomatoes were not just safe to consume, but actually beneficial. All that free advertising, all that media coverage around tomato medicine ended up massively boosting public interest in eating actual tomatoes and tomato-based products, including, you guessed it, tomato ketchup. So this fake medicine craze accidentally became one of the biggest marketing pushes tomato ketchup ever got, decades before it became the household staple we know today, which is honestly one of the strangest bits of unintentional marketing history in American food culture.
Now here's where a name you definitely recognize enters the story. Henry J. Heinz. Homemade tomato ketchup was still incredibly popular throughout American households by the mid-1800s, but there was a massive problem that most people don't think about: spoilage. Making ketchup at home was genuinely risky because without modern preservatives or refrigeration, homemade tomato sauces could spoil quickly, sometimes leading to mold growth, bacterial contamination, and in some documented cases, actual foodborne illness. Commercial ketchup manufacturers at the time were dealing with the exact same problem, and their solution was honestly kind of horrifying by modern standards. A lot of early commercial ketchup companies were using heavy doses of chemical preservatives, most notably a compound called sodium benzoate, along with using lower quality, sometimes rotten or overripe tomatoes, since the added chemicals and heavy spicing could mask the taste of spoiled ingredients. There were even accusations at the time that some manufacturers used tomato scraps swept up off factory floors, mixed with coloring agents to hide discoloration. Henry Heinz, who had already built a food business around products like horseradish and pickles, and who had actually gone bankrupt once before in the 1870s trying to sell a different product, saw a massive opportunity here to differentiate his ketchup completely. In 1876, Heinz launched his tomato ketchup with a bold, almost radical promise for the time: no artificial preservatives at all. Instead, Heinz relied on using genuinely ripe, high-quality tomatoes, combined with higher concentrations of vinegar and sugar, which naturally helped preserve the product without needing chemical additives. This wasn't just a health decision, it was a brilliant marketing decision, because Heinz could now advertise his ketchup as pure, at a time when public trust in the food industry was actually pretty shaky, largely because of exactly these kinds of preservative and food safety scandals happening across the industry. And this trust issue would eventually culminate in the passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, a piece of legislation that Heinz himself actually publicly supported, positioning his company as the responsible, trustworthy choice years ahead of the regulation even existing. Heinz also made another genius move that completely changed how ketchup was sold. He packaged it in clear glass bottles instead of the dark, opaque bottles or ceramic jars most competitors were using. And this wasn't random. Heinz specifically wanted customers to be able to see the ketchup inside the bottle, to visually verify that it was bright red, vibrant, and free of any visible spoilage or discoloration, reinforcing that whole pure and clean branding he was building. It worked incredibly well. Heinz's ketchup exploded in popularity throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the company aggressively expanded, eventually becoming one of the dominant ketchup brands not just in America, but globally. And here's a fun little side detail most people don't know. The famous 57 varieties slogan that's still printed on Heinz bottles today didn't actually correspond to any real number of products the company made. Henry Heinz reportedly just liked the way the numbers 5 and 7 looked together and thought they sounded lucky, even though by the time he came up with the slogan around 1996, his company was already producing over 60 different products. It was pure marketing invention, a completely made-up number that stuck around for over a century simply because it sounded catchy. Heinz also became famous for one of the most oddly effective marketing campaigns in food history, actually leading into a complaint people had about the product. Customers frequently joked and complained about how frustratingly slow Heinz ketchup poured out of the glass bottle, thanks to its thick consistency. And instead of trying to fix that, Heinz team flipped it into a selling point, famously advertising the ketchup's thickness as proof of its quality using the slogan, "Slow Good Ketchup," essentially
essentially telling customers that thick, slow-pouring ketchup meant it was made with real high-quality tomatoes, rather than being watered down like cheaper competitors. This thick consistency thing wasn't just marketing fluff either. It's actually backed by real food science. Ketchup is what's called a non-Newtonian fluid, meaning its thickness, technically its viscosity, changes depending on the force applied to it. When the bottle is sitting still, ketchup behaves almost like a solid gel, which is exactly why it gets stuck and won't pour. But once you apply enough force, whether that's shaking it, hitting the bottom of the glass bottle, or squeezing a modern plastic bottle, the internal structure of the ketchup temporarily breaks down and it suddenly flows like a liquid, sometimes way faster than you expect, which is why so many people have ended up with a huge unexpected splat of ketchup on their plate, or honestly on their shirt, after hitting the bottle a little too hard. This weird chemical property is actually why for decades people developed this whole ritual of smacking the bottom of a glass Heinz bottle to get the ketchup moving, something that became such a recognizable part of American food culture that eventually led Heinz to redesign the entire bottle in the 1980s and 1990s, specifically to solve that same physics problem in a more convenient way, letting gravity do the work that used to require an open palm and a bit of frustration. So next time you're squeezing that bottle or ripping open one of those little packets at a fast food place, just remember, you're using a product that started as fermented fish guts in ancient China, got turned into mushroom and walnut sauce by British sailors who couldn't recreate the original recipe, got falsely marketed as a miracle medicine that people swallowed in pill form to cure diarrhea, survived a nationwide food safety scandal involving rotten tomatoes and factory floor sweepings, and eventually became one of the most successful food products in American history because one guy figured out that letting people see through the bottle, admitting the product was slow, and making up a number that sounded catchy was somehow the smartest marketing combination anyone had ever put together.